Good morning, I guess. It's still morning. Good to be here today. I want to just share a few insights with you from some of the work I'm doing. We won't go through every country of the world with statistics related to each of them, don't worry. I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of some of the work that I've been doing for the last 20 years. And some of this does appear in my new book, Our Global Families, if you want to follow up with that. But first, let me introduce my family to you. I have 3 daughters and my wife, Tricia. For some of you that know, Tricia is the youngest daughter of Ralph and Roberta Winter, who founded the U.S. Center for World Mission in Pasadena. They have both passed on, and the other 3 sisters live various places around the world, and we're all involved in God's mission in some way. We're having a big reunion early next year in Seattle. My oldest daughter, who's just to the left, my wife Tricia, by the way, is teaching English as a second language to immigrants and to international students in Boston. That's what she's doing this morning. She's really good at it, and it's a great gift to people coming from all over the world who want to learn English. Right next to her is my oldest daughter, Laura. She graduates in 3 weeks from the University of Glasgow with a master's degree in transnational crime, justice, and security, and wants to work in the field of human trafficking. My second oldest on the far right, Claire. She's also at Glasgow. They love Scotland, these 2 girls. And she's getting a master's degree in urban planning and public policy and would like to make a difference in different places around the world. Valerie on the far left is a senior in high school. She's hoping to go to Brandeis next year in Boston if things work out. When Valerie was 4 years old, we moved from Singapore to South Hamilton, where we live now. And the first Sunday that we were there, we went to church, and it happened to be Mission Sunday. Now, I'm a missions research person, a global Christianity research person. My daughter knew that. So they asked in the class, they said, "Does anybody here know a missionary?" And my daughter raised her hand, and she said, "My daddy's a missionary, but he never tells anyone about Jesus." So the Sunday school teacher told this to me, and I thought, boy, how mission research isn't very exciting. So I told her, I said, "Sweetheart, Daddy went to school and got all these degrees, a doctorate degree and all this, so that he could do this research so everybody would know where Christians are and everything." So the next week she went to Sunday school, and before the teacher could say anything, she raised her hand and she said, "My daddy is a doctor, but he can't help anyone." So that sort of sums up my career from the viewpoint of my precious 4-year-old who's now 17. Okay, so what I want to do just briefly this morning is introduce you to some of the books that I've been working on, and really what are the findings behind these that are relevant for God's mission today, our place in it. And this is the first book, The Atlas of Global Christianity, that was mentioned. This was done for the 100th anniversary of the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, Scotland. It was published by Edinburgh University Press. The atlas, there was an atlas in 1910, but it was called an Atlas of Protestant Missions, and it had a bunch of maps of the world with little red dots everywhere that there were Protestants working. And 100 years later, we couldn't do such an atlas. Really, we felt that it had to be about Christianity, all of Christianity. And right on the cover is the resurrection of Jesus, done by He Shi, who is a Chinese artist from southwest China. So a completely different feel about that. We had 64 different people contribute essays, and especially the historical essays. So when you read the history of Christianity in Eastern Africa over the 100-year period, 1910 to 2010, it's written by a Kenyan, not a German, even though there are plenty of Germans who know the history of East Africa. We wanted to hear from someone from that region. Okay, so that's kind of the nature of this. Now, just a few things to think about from this book. I hope you can see this, at least the broad outlines of this. This is a pretty important chart in relation to this topic. This is the whole history of Christianity, and there's a gray line that dips way down on this chart, and what you're looking at is the percentage of all the Christians in the world who are from the global south, which would be Africa, Asia, Latin America. And there's a couple of surprising things. One is that for 900 years, the majority of Christians in the world were Africans and Asians. I'm teaching a course next semester at Gordon-Conwell, first time ever. I'm team teaching it with a Chinese professor. It's a church history course, that's the key here, called A History of Christianity in Asia. And it is told not as an extension of European history. In almost all the textbooks, that 900 years, almost all the textbooks talk about Europe, Europe, Europe. And yet the majority of Christians were Asians and Africans. So we're going to try to tell this story from that viewpoint, especially across these centuries. Then you can see by the time of the Reformation, and we're getting close to the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, 92% of all Christians were Europeans, all right, which is a bit unnatural in a sense from where we were before. And then you see, as you get to the year 1900, there a line that just goes straight up, and it was only in about 1981, which wasn't all that long ago, that Christians in the global south now, which would include Latin America since 1500. So now Asia, Africa, Latin America, outnumbered, just pure demographics, outnumbered Christians in the north. You see, and that's in our lifetime, you could say, and look at how steep that line is. So in one sense, it's that steep line that is part of what I want to talk about today. Now, if you look at it in a different way, this is the percentage of the world that has been Christian since 1900, probably into the future here a little ways. And you'll see it's about a third of the world's population. If you're in the hospital and you look over at the machine next to you and it's doing this is bad. It's like the last thing you might ever see. But this really masks that terrific change we saw on the other graph, and so I want to just mention this. I think most of you are aware of this. It's been written a lot about. We're the ones who try to keep working on the numbers behind it, and I'll show you a few things you probably haven't seen too. So in the atlas we have simple chart like this, which just divides up the Christians of the world into all these continents, and you see that in 1910, Europe dominated the chart, right? 66% of all Christians in the world were European. Then almost another 15% North American, who are mainly from Europe at that point, and that adds up to over 80%. And that's where we say, most Christians in 1910 were Europeans, North Americans. Now watch what happens, especially to that big Europe piece here on the bottom. This is 2010. Now it's just 25%, and even the North American piece is now just 12%. You put those together, and that's under 40%. That's a huge shift. Now here's another chart that's pretty new. We're still working out what this means. See that big arrow in the middle? That's where you are. We're actually there's three things meeting right there. What this is the percent of the world's Christians in each continent. It's a different map showing change over time. Blue is Europe, so you see it dominated, and it's 1900 all the way to, looks like 2100 across the bottom there. So we're trying to look into the future. The percentage of the world's Christians that are European has been declining through this whole period. The green is Latin America, and for a few years, as of 2 years ago, the majority of Christians in the world are Latin Americans. That's the biggest single group of Christians. But there's a red line coming from the other direction. That's Africa. And this is a pretty striking chart because you can see where Africa is going here. Possibly by the year 2100, half of all Christians in the world will be African. So you can see this is a dynamic, changing situation. And people obviously need to think about what this means. I'm going to look at it from one perspective here, just to try for us to think about this a little bit. There's a Chinese graphic designer who moved to Berlin. And one of the first things she noticed, of course, is that the Chinese and the Germans are very different in how they look at life. All right? So being a graphic designer, she came up with a series of icons. The one on the left is the Germans, the one on the right is the Chinese. So punctuality, the Germans, right on time. I'm 1/4 German, so I'm standing up here right on time, right? But the Chinese, there's a little bit of play in that. And you could look at some other cultures might even have more play as to what is on time and what's late. How about a queue when waiting in line? This is a handling of problems. So the Germans just walk straight through the problem, and the Chinese kind of go around it a little bit. Here's the queue here, waiting in line. You can see a considerable difference between these two. Then we have opinion. You see the German very direct and the Chinese not so direct. Now here we have contacts, and it may be a little hard to see here, but the Germans just have a couple of contacts, whereas the Chinese are in a great web of relationships. Now, we're just saying that the shift in the center of gravity of Christianity has gone from the north to the south, let's say from the Germans to the Chinese. China's in the global south by the UN definition. And when I look at this, I start to think, isn't the Christian faith actually a little bit more compatible with the culture depicted here on the right? In this country, we have, just close to where I live, we have a professor who wrote a book called Bowling Alone, which is about how bad community has gotten in the United States. People are even bowling all by themselves, and surely that's not a good thing. And there's lots of books coming out in this country about how to regain community and that sort of a thing. But what if that's just part of your culture? Maybe that's something for us to think about. And then we have the way of life. The individual in Germany and the group in China. And again, thinking about this from a Christian point of view, you'd see maybe there's more compatibility with much of what we're trying to do and live on the right than the left. Now, the reason to bring this up is that most of the books, most of the theological education, most of what goes on in training around the world still comes from the left here, through translation and through other means. And I wanted to highlight that because that's a big tension here. We've got more people, demographically speaking, on the right now, but much of what is Christianity in all the major traditions still is seated here on the left. And this is a big enough subject that there's several books about it. One of my favorite is called Mangoes or Bananas, An Authentic Asian Christianity and Missiology, Bishop Hua Yung, who is a Chinese bishop, a Methodist Chinese bishop in Malaysia. And he said, he laments the fact that most of Christianity, from his view, is like a banana. It's yellow on the outside but white on the inside. So all the training has been done, again, through this German, let's say, German-American, European point of view. And he says, when will we see the day when Christianity in Asia is like a mango? It's yellow on the outside, yellow on the inside. And some of the indigenous thinking that is so important for Christians to do. So I would say, just based on our studies, this is the single biggest renovation project within Christianity now. It's the decolonization of Christianity, the re-traditionalizing, and it's global. It's even happening in this country. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a really excellent book which parallels this called Rescuing the Gospel from the Cowboys, which is a way for Native Americans to begin to reclaim some of what was taken away from them. You may be aware of the fact that when they went to Christian boarding schools, Native Americans, if they spoke in their mother tongue, they were hit with a stick. That's the opposite of what indigenous Christianity is all about. And so the stick is gone, but there's a lot of residual effects within Native American Christianity, and there's many who would love to see a return of the drums, the powwows, all of the wonderful things that are part of Native American culture. So this is a global undertaking. This fellow right here, I lived with my sabbatical for a year in Chiang Mai, and he says this: the biggest issue the church in Asia is facing is a severe violation of the incarnational principle from both missionaries and local church leaders. Contextualization has been very poor, making Christianity so foreign to local people. So Thai people, who I've lived among on numerous occasions, see Christianity as a Western religion, even though Christianity is no longer demographically Western, and it wasn't for many, many hundreds of years at the beginning. So this is something probably to grapple with, and we'll come back to it as we think about mission as well. The other major problem that we've studied and we think Christians have to deal with is fragmentation. There are 45,000 Christian denominations in the world. In Korea, there's over 150 Presbyterian denominations alone. So there's a lot of fragmentation in Christianity. It reminds me of a joke. And the joke has to do with a fellow on a desert island who's there for many, many years. And finally a ship comes by to rescue him. And the captain comes down on this island and he sees 3 huts. So here's the 3 huts. Sees 3 huts and he sees this guy. He says, "How did you manage this? Tell me about your life here." And the fellow says, "Well, this first hut is where I've lived all of these years, and the second hut is where I go to church." And the captain says, "Well, what's the third hut?" He says, "Oh, that's where I used to go to church." Okay. So even one person on an island can't manage to stay in the same denomination. And I think this is a big challenge for us, which I'll come back to at the very end. Okay, here's the other book that I worked on, which is another set of findings, which I'll give you. The World's Religions and Figures. This is an expensive textbook, and we wrote it, Brian Grimm and I, he was at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. We wrote it together because every time we give a presentation, we say, are there any questions? And the first question is, where do you get all these numbers? So we wrote a whole book on where we get all the numbers. And so if you're really interested, you can follow that. We had the delight of the sociologist Peter Berger, who wrote the foreword to our book. But Berger is a bit of a jokester himself. And in the foreword to our book, just imagine this. The foreword to our book, he says, this is pretty interesting stuff, but it reminded him of an old joke. And the joke goes like this. As the lady said to the insect specialist after sitting next to him at a dinner party, during which he told her endlessly about his beloved insects, she said, "This is very interesting if you are interested in it." You see. So that's kind of a backhanded compliment from Peter Berger. But nonetheless, we felt it was important to put this into print, where we get all these numbers. And it's pretty interesting if you're interested in it. Okay. Here's 3 unique features of our work, just to give it. We're international. That might surprise you. Most research is on the Western world. That's where all the money is. In fact, in the behavioral sciences, they say psychological research is weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic nations. So you say, what are human beings like? And then you just interview rich people. You do not get what human beings are like. That's a major criticism. We do everything we can to study every single country in the world. Next is interdisciplinary. We are not just using sociology. We have anthropology, linguistics, history, religious studies, phenomenology. We're looking all around, everywhere that we can, to get the best picture of what global Christianity is. And then chronological, as you saw, I've got these charts showing the change over time. It's not good enough just to look at what the situation is now. And expensive research, survey research, does not go way back, nor does it go into the future, of course, and that's one limitation that we try to overcome. I should mention that David Barrett founded this research about 50 years ago in Kenya. In 1965, he started a unit of research in the Church of the Province of East Africa, of the Anglican Church, and we're carrying on his tradition. Here he is giving a copy of the World Christian Encyclopedia to John Paul II. And so we're actually The first one was in about 1980. The second one I worked on was in the year 2000, and I now have a 29-year-old doctoral student. We've signed a contract together for the third edition of the World Christian Encyclopedia, which we hope will come out by 2020. How about changes in religion? These might be a little small for you. There's two shocking changes between 1910 and 2010. One is that Chinese folk religion has shrunk. Now, how did that happen? That's because of the rise of communism in China. The other thing is that the Muslim portion, which was 12.6% in 1910, is 22% in 2010. So it's grown quite a bit. The interesting thing is that these two trends, one shrinking, the other growing, are not related at all. But it's important to see that this is the big change. Remember, Christians have been about a third of the world's population throughout this entire time. I'll probably forget to say it, so I'll tell you something that we're thinking about right now, and that is, so the World Christian Encyclopedia, the Atlas, are all about the shift of Christianity to the South as far as demographics go. But something is happening, and that is, the reason that Christianity stayed at about a third of the world's population is sort of massive losses in Europe, except in Eastern Europe, and then fast-growing churches in the global South. And that changed the balance without changing the percentage. Our observations right now say that the growth of the churches in the global South is now outpacing the losses in the North. And I showed you that flat line, but actually there's a tick at the end, and we think the world might be 36% Christian, let's say, by 2050 or so. So that's an interesting dynamic. Our third edition of our encyclopedia might be about how this is shifting now in relation to the world's population. So that's a big change. Okay, so those are a couple of changes. Here's global religion. Blue is Christian, green, Islam, brown, tribal, religionists, and pink is Hindu, orange is Buddhism, and then there's another kind of reddish color that is Chinese folk religion. Just watch what happens to Africa over 100 years, and you can see quite a big change. You have the decline of tribal religion because most of the people who became Christians in Africa were tribal religionists. You'd also see quite a bit of growth of Islam there, and that's another dynamic you could keep your eye on. Now, if we talk about 1910 and 2010, it's quite obvious that the world is less religious today than it was in 100 years ago. More people belong to religion in 1910, almost everybody, I mean, from a demographic point of view. And now we have a fairly large atheist and agnostic population around the world. But here's something you might not realize, and this is one of many charts we're trying to get at. You see, most people were religionists that belonged to some religion. What you see here, that's in 1900. Then you see about 1970, it actually goes back up the other way. This is the collapse of communism after that. The change point would be probably a little bit further over. But what I'm saying here is that the world is more religious today than it was in 1970. So actually, if you're studying this, you see that the world is becoming more religious every single day as a whole. And part of the reason for this is the growth of religion in China, which affects everybody else. Sure, there's more atheists in Sweden every year, but Sweden doesn't tip the balance like China does, okay? So, and in fact, another thing is the majority of atheists and agnostics in the world are actually Chinese, not Swedish, and so on. So that's another side of it that has to be considered. So our world is becoming more religious. That might be a little bit surprising. Of course, Africa has seen a great transformation. I already mentioned that. Here's another way to look at it. Each square represents 1% of the population. Blue is Christian, green is Islam, brown is tribal religion or ethno-religion. And you can see quite a change over the 100-year period that you saw on the map. The most religiously diverse place in the world is Asia. That's where you have all the major religions, and you have Places like Singapore, which are truly diverse, where there's no more than 30% of any single religion. That's how diversity is defined in the United States, by the way. And in the year, I think it's the year 2000, there were only 2 counties in the entire country that were diverse in that sense. One in New York and one in California, I think, where no racial group was more than 30% of the population. So we have diversity like in this country, but we still have an overwhelming percentage of either one race or one religion or however you want to look at it. So that's something to consider. When I lived in Singapore, I thought that was pretty amazing, where 30% are Chinese folk, and then you have Muslims, you have 20% Christian now, and so on. So Hindus, it's really quite a remarkable place to live in relation to that. Now, this looks rather static. You've got all these different countries with different majority religions. What's shaking all this up is our theme, and that's migration. And the Pew study on migration had a very shocking finding, and that you can see it here. They like red as Christian and green as Muslim, but then all the maps look like Christmas. We don't think that works very well. But nonetheless, half of all people on the move, currently on the move, are Christians. But didn't we just say only a third of the world's population is Christian? So that's a disproportionate amount. And a lot of that is from Latin America. And Muslims, about 23% of the world's population, are 27% of all migrants. So there's a disproportionate number of Christians and Muslims who are on the move. Only about 55% of the world's population together, but about 75 up to 79% of all migrants. That's something to consider. Let me tell you something else about Christians and Muslims, and that is in 1800, those 2 religions together only made up 33% of the world's population together. Now by 1970, it was almost half. It's going to be a 57%, we think, in 2020. But we think even before the year 2100, maybe 10, 20 years before that, it will be 66%. And what we're saying is that in 300 years, there was a change from 1/3 of the world's population being Christian or Muslim to 2/3 of the world. That is phenomenal. And it probably, I think at the end here, I'm going to make a suggestion about Christian-Muslim relations, but put in the demographic context, these 2 religions need to learn how to get along. Just as a word of advice for religious communities, since this is such a strong demographic weight. Okay? Now the third piece of research is from this report, which can be downloaded free from our website. Our books are very expensive, our big books, but we do occasionally try to do something that's free, and we did this report from Christianity in 1970 to 2020. This is what 1970 looked like, if you can't remember. This was the latest and greatest, and we think 2020, well, maybe not like this, but there's always a tendency to romanticize the future. But we wanted to compare that 50-year period, because our atlas was the 100-year period from 1910 to 2010, and this would be more recent to try to get a handle around what's going on around the world. At the beginning of that period, by the way, I just threw this slide in. This is my father-in-law, Ralph Winter, at the Lausanne meeting in Switzerland in 1974. Billy Graham called a bunch of people together, and there were a couple of very important talks there. His was one of them. His talk said that if every Christian in the world went out and shared their faith with somebody in their same ethnic and linguistic group, that half of the world's population would not hear about Christ. And this developed into the concept of unreached peoples, hidden peoples, the fact that many ethno-linguistic and people groups around the world had no Christian presence. So you couldn't simply speak of everyone doing what has been called near neighbor evangelism, where you don't have to learn another language. So this came at a time when many people were saying there's no need for any more missionaries in the world. Missionaries moratorium and so on. And yet this fact sort of showed that there's still many people who had not ever heard of Christ. Okay? The other important talk was by the Latin Americans who said evangelicals are very poor at integrating evangelism and social justice, and you should listen to us, which was a good thing, actually. And a lot of things have happened. Most evangelicals nowadays will say, yeah, evangelism and social justice, they're both critical. I'm teaching a course right now on NGOs and development and mission at Gordon-Conwell, and I have 19 students from 8 different countries in the class. And what I said to them at the beginning, I said, look, all our documents, our evangelical documents, say that these are important and need to be integrated. Integral mission is one of the things that's come out of this. But I said the problem is it's not intuitive in the evangelical context. And that's what I'm working for in my class, is that you would intuitively see that it would be a good idea to go out and serve people all over the world at the same time as you still have good news for the rest of the world. So trying to integrate those, I think, is really difficult, and I think we're still working on it in that context. Okay, some things about Christian mission that you might not be aware of. First of all, most Christian outreach of all kinds, this would be Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Evangelical, Pentecostal, never goes to non-Christians. How could that be? Well, what's behind this is the fact that with 45,000 denominations, you've always got other people within Christianity who might benefit from your version of Christianity. And so there's a lot of evangelism, which is really just from one Christian group to the other. And this can create enormous tension. I know you remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, 5,000 evangelical agencies went in and began working among the Orthodox in Russia and Ukraine. There was a study done in Kiev at that time which showed that on average an Orthodox church member in Ukraine was approached 27 times a month, which is almost once a day, by different people. One day, will you become Baptist? The next day, how about being Pentecostal? The next day, how about being Presbyterian? And so on. So that's a lot of tension, and that's what's behind this. Now, another set of research that we did found out that 86% of all Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists do not personally know a Christian. So we have a gap, in a relationship gap, that's absolutely essential to overcome, because it makes no sense to share faith without friendship and without hospitality, without actually knowing people personally. The incarnational nature of Christianity is such that you don't just beam the gospel message and have no contact with people. So we think actually this is the biggest challenge in the 21st century. The 20th century had a lot of plans to try to reach everybody in the world, but it doesn't matter what your plan is, it has to include face-to-face contact and friendship. And not just friendship that says, if you accept my message, I'll be friends with you, and if you don't, goodbye. That isn't a legitimate means either. So this, we think, is very important. There's still some imbalances, like my father-in-law, Ralph Winter, saw. 1 in 6 people in the world live in slums. Only 1 in 500 missionaries live in slums. And even local people, we think as few as 1 in 10,000 pastors live in slums. So it isn't just the national people do it. Nobody's doing it. We need to see a fresh emphasis on reaching people in the slums. And then in my class, we were reading Nicholas Kristof's book, A Path Appears. It's an excellent book. Right in the middle of that book, Kristof and Wu Dun, who wrote this together, they wrote Half the Sky as well, if you've read that. They're New York Times correspondents. Right in the middle of the book, Kristof says, there's something that really grieves me, and that is I've traveled all around the world Cheryl and I have traveled all around the world, and we meet wonderful people to the left and to the right, you might say, even in relation to religion. And we're really grieved that these people do not talk to each other. And so one of the challenges for religious people of all kinds is to work with secular organizations and on behalf of the humanity that we're all trying to help. He calls it the God gap. And he faults both people, religious people and secular people, for not talking to each other. So that's something we want to see as well. Now, wrapping up, in my book, Our Global Families, we talk about solidarity, of course, with Christians, the Christian family, because it's so divided. But we also talk about solidarity with the global human family. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who of course you all know, wrote, "The first law of our being is that we are set in a delicate network of interdependence with our fellow human beings and with the rest of God's creation." And then Yo-Yo Ma, who's pictured here, bringing together people from all different musical backgrounds, he writes this: "As we open up to each other, we form a bridge into unfamiliar traditions, banishing the fear that often accompanies change and dislocation. In other words, when we broaden our lens on the world, we better understand ourselves, our own life and culture. We share more in common with the far reaches of our small planet than we realize." And we really want to make this appeal for Christians in particular to really embrace their global human family and to be excellent members of this wider society in every way. And that's another message behind what we're trying to do. Now, quick responses. What kind of action can be taken? How about we address the fragmentation and duplication? One study we did found that Christians are 100 times more effective at planting churches where there are already Christians than where there are no Christians. Okay, so that's something to think about. The issue of identification, who do you identify with? People talk about the fragmentation again, but also all the diversity within Christianity. This is not really a picture of beauty with all of the different pieces just laid out on the floor like this. This is the reality that there are many different forms of Christianity, different languages, cultures, races, so on. But we like to think of Christianity as in its beautiful form here. In this, I'm using a car here, which might not be the most effective, but not just a bunch of pieces, but we're all in this together. Okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. How about we strengthen both our theological understanding and our knowledge about other world religions? In this country, Pew studies have shown that people don't understand other world religions. Atheists actually score the highest on the tests about other religions, and this is really important. And then, of course, you have the two versions of God, just basically being the same for everyone. One is a secular version, which says it's all superstition anyway, so it's equally the same. And the other would be a religious version, all roads lead to the same God. I have a colleague at Boston University who wrote a book called God is Not One, which Stephen Prothero, who's a religious studies professor there, saying it doesn't do the religions a service by saying they're all the same, because none of the religions say they're the same. So we have to learn how to get along in that real difference between all the religions. We also then need to empower our own people to interact in religiously diverse communities. And I would say, obviously Christian-Muslim is very important, but we just had a guest at Gordon-Conwell, first time ever, an atheist from the Harvard Humanist Association who spoke on devout atheism. We packed out our lunch. We thought maybe 30 people would come, and 100 students showed up. I gave a talk at chapel right before she came. She was there in the audience, called Listening to Atheists, which was an appeal for evangelicals in particular to listen and not to put people in a box. And that was a very, very successful interaction just a couple of weeks ago. We had the head of the American Jewish Committee with us the next week, who's a very good friend of mine in Boston. Then we need to encourage hospitality, which I think is one of the lost arts. On Thanksgiving this year, we will have my wife's ESL students with us. Most are not Christians, actually, in the context where she teaches down in Boston. We ask them, we go around the table, we've done this for many years, and we say, how long have you been in the United States? 2, 3, 4 years. And have you ever been invited to an American home? They say, no, this is the first time. Every time. Every person, every single time. Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Peru, it doesn't matter where they're from, they're not invited into people's homes. And my wife just got a note from one of our Japanese students. She said, my husband and I were in Boston for 4 years, and coming to your house was one of the highlights of our time there. So this is something we need to see happen. And I already said, improving Christian-Muslim relations. I taught a course that focused on medieval Spain when business people, artists, and scholars of Muslim, Christian, and Jew worked together in medieval Spain for quite a long time. Maybe that's time for that again. And then how about a truly global approach? I'll stop there, where we really are valuing within our own global Christian family people from all the traditions. It's not translation from the West to the rest, but translation back the other direction, I think, is what we need to see. And that's starting to happen a little bit in hymnals. My own Lutheran hymnal now has songs from Nigeria and Korea and so on. It needs to push back in that direction so that these gifts are shared between all of our different communities. And that really is my prayer as we go forward. Thank you.